Safe, affordable housing is essential to everybody. But for renters with disabilities, access to housing that meets their needs is also a question of independence, dignity, and equality. Broken elevators and blocked ramps create major daily obstacles. Landlords who refuse reasonable accommodations further complicate life. According to a recent report from the City of Detroit, approximately 1 in 5 Detroit residents lives with a disability. Of those Detroiters, 43% live below the poverty level. According to census data, in 2023, the median income for a Detroit resident with a disability was $23,405, compared to $32,712 for a non-disabled resident. Stronger building code enforcement, better tenant support services, and more clear complaint procedures can help remove barriers and make housing safer and more inclusive. Federal and state laws also protect the rights of individuals with disabilities. These laws, like the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, give people the right to request changes necessary to fully utilize their homes. Still, too many homes are inaccessible, unaffordable, or simply unavailable to renters who need them. Weak enforcement of existing laws further limits real options for people seeking accessible housing. Today on Legally Speaking, we'll discuss the basics of disability and housing law. We'll talk about tenants' rights in practice and useful guidance for requesting accommodations. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Legally Speaking. I'm Ashley Lowe. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Lakeshore Legal Aid, and we're a nonprofit law firm that provides free civil legal services to people living with low incomes, older adults, and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault throughout the state of Michigan. Today on Legally Speaking, we're going to talk about the intersection between housing and disability law. And our guests are 2 experts who help tenants better understand their rights and make housing more inclusive and accessible for everyone. So let's get started with our first guest. Dessa Cosma is our first guest, and I'm so glad that you could be here with us today. Dessa is a lifelong social justice advocate. She has a master's degree in social justice, and in 2018, she founded the Detroit Disability Power. And that organization's goal is to build the organizing and political power of the disability community while strengthening connections between disability justice and broader social movements. Thanks for being here, Dessa.
So glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. And we're also joined by Marie Reimers. Marie is a supervising attorney in Lakeshore's Detroit Eviction Department, and her job is to lead a team of legal advocates who help represent tenants facing eviction in Detroit's 36th District Court. Marie is recognized as an expert at the statewide level in landlord-tenant law, and she's a loyal Detroiter who loves representing her neighbors as a legal aid attorney. Thanks for being here, Marie.
Thank you, Ashley.
All right, so let's get started on our topic today. Dessa, can we talk about disability and what really qualifies as a disability under federal and state law?
Absolutely. So the disability community is very large and very diverse. But the way that the relevant laws for today's conversation define disability is that a person has a physical or mental impairment that limits their ability to do daily tasks such as walking or hearing or working or learning or taking care of oneself. And that definition is used to determine what rights a person has and what protections they have under laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Fair Housing Act, and 504 of the Rehab Act. These are really important for people to understand because if we know our rights, we know how to advocate for ourselves.
And so why is it that disability rights, obviously they matter for people with disabilities. Why is that important for everybody that people with disabilities have their rights recognized?
Well, first and foremost, for a functioning society, fairness is a pretty important value to practice. But also, everyone loves a person with a disability. All families have somebody with a disability in them, whether or not they identify that way or really talk about it that way. Disability is so common that it touches everyone. If you're not a person with a disability now, chances are you'll become one. It could happen to anyone at any time. And if we're lucky enough to age, we will certainly become disabled. So whether or not we're disabled, we all have an incentive to build a society that is accessible and equitable for people with disabilities.
Dessa, let's talk about tenants' rights. What are those rights for everybody?
So a tenant has the right to make a request for a reasonable accommodation or reasonable modification. They do not have to explain their diagnosis. They may need a letter from a doctor or a social worker, but they don't have to provide too much private medical information.
Let's stop right there, because that's an interesting question for me. What if it is a disability that is known or obvious? Does a person with disabilities have to provide any kind of proof that they have a disability?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that, Ashley. And so the answer is no. So if the disability is obvious, and if the accommodation that the tenant is asking for is also obvious, then no, they don't need to provide proof that they need that accommodation. So an example of that may be that you live in subsidized housing and you receive a Social Security check once a month based on your disability. If you live in subsidized housing, you are providing your income to your landlord, so they know you receive that Social Security. So when you ask for the accommodation of a later due date for your rent, they already know you get that SSI, and they can't ask for additional documentation of your disability at that point.
Great, that's good to know. Thank you. Thanks. What about the other tenant rights? What other rights do tenants have?
Well, you can't be discriminated against for being disabled in the first place. So if you're going to look for a place to live and you feel like you were not given a fair chance to sign a lease, you should make a complaint with the Fair Housing Center. And you have the right to have a service animal, and you have the right to ask for those accommodations when you move in or later.
Right. So let's talk about, we talked about kind of modifications or accommodations if somebody needs that. So is there funding for this? Does Detroit provide funding to help make those modifications?
For renters? Not exactly. Okay. So oftentimes the renter may have to pay for those reasonable modifications, and there are some nuance that maybe Marie can speak to on that. But in Detroit, there is a program for owner-occupied homes where the disabled person that owns and lives in that home can receive some support to make their house more accessible. And this is a result of organizing by disabled residents. So this program is fairly new, but unfortunately at this point it doesn't go to rental properties. And so that's another place that we can organize and try to get some resources.
Okay, so the homeowner who lives in their property could have access to these funds, but if they're a homeowner and they want to make modifications for their renter, there's not a fund available for that.
Not currently in Detroit, no.
Okay, thank you. And so what are some common accessibility issues that people might not even be aware of?
So yeah, some of the more obvious ones are things like wheelchair access and making sure that a person can get into their apartment safely, maybe no stairs, wide enough doors, cutaways under sinks so that you can pull up to wash your dishes and do your cooking, a barrier-free shower, for example, grab bars, things that make a home safe and comfortable and convenient for somebody with a mobility disability. But you can also have process changes that help a person navigate their home. Maybe that is asking for the rent to be due on a slightly different day because of when the SSI check arrives, for example. So there are, things that are about the built environment of a home and the actual structure, but there are also things about how the systems of living there work and the relationship with the landlord.
So Dessa, what happens when a tenant is living in a building maybe and they're seeing these things? What happens when they lift these up to the landlords?
Well, hopefully they have a responsive landlord or property manager who takes their request or their complaint and makes the modification that's being requested. Oftentimes though, unfortunately, a property manager or landlord may not know what they're responsible for, or they may be resistant for various reasons. Maybe they think it's going to be too expensive. Maybe they don't think they have to. Maybe they think that the tenant is annoying or asking for too much, not knowing that it's within the rights of that disabled tenant. And so there can become friction there, and that's really unfortunate because it's really important for disabled people to feel comfortable and safe in their home.
Right, so sometimes maybe they get labeled as being a complainer or somebody who's just never going to be happy with what they have, but when in fact they have the right.
Absolutely, and actually, I know this mother-daughter duo, and they are just a dynamo. The daughter is a disabled teenager. Her mom is an incredible advocate for her, and they have had consistently a hard time finding a place to live where the daughter in a wheelchair can be safe and comfortable. And I remember her telling me a story about how when they moved in this one apartment, the carpets were filthy and it smelled terrible, and the air quality just seemed unsafe. And the daughter has asthma, so they asked for professional cleaning of the carpet before they finished moving in. And they were labeled annoying and told they were unreasonable. And they ended up working through that, and then winter came, and the snow plowing company kept putting all this snow right on the ramp outside the door of their apartment, and so the daughter couldn't get on the school bus in the morning without her mom having to plow all this snow that had been piled up. And when they complained, they were labeled annoying and unreasonable, and sadly, they ended up having to move.
Wow, just for asking for things that allow them to actually use their home.
Yeah.
So, one thing I have always thought is, well, building codes kind of set the minimum, right? And so that people should have access to their homes because of those codes. Am I wrong about that?
The minimum code requirements are very important, and yet they don't necessarily mean that a home meets a person's needs entirely. And part of that is that the disability experience is very diverse, and so even two people with the same disability might have slightly different needs.
Sure.
So for example, you may have to have an accessible entrance to an apartment building, but sometimes the accessible entrance is way around the back through a scary dark alley, and maybe the door is often locked. So it might be technically meeting the code, but it's not actually convenient or equal for the disabled person who's using it.
And I've also heard about this concept of being grandfathered in under building codes or other ADA that set those minimum requirements. Is that a real thing? Can a building be grandfathered in and not have to meet those requirements?
No, it's actually a myth. It's a pretty persistent myth, and any public building needs to meet those requirements. However, there is a balance between meeting those requirements and putting an extreme burden on the owner or manager of that building. Okay. And so it has to be, to make an existing building accessible, has to not be too much of a financial stress on the owner of the building. And so there's going to be a little give and take, but there's no blanket grandfathering in. And I would say, just as code is a good floor, it doesn't stop us from doing better. So a landlord can meet the code and go beyond that if they want to be an excellent landlord and if they want to make their space accessible to the greatest amount of potential tenants, which is actually a great business investment. Right. And relatedly, in terms of this myth around grandfathering, there is no grandfathering in. Even though there's a balance between financial burden, I don't think we should have the mindset of I don't have to do it, so I'm not going to. Right. We can really have a better mindset of what can I do? Maybe I can't do everything, but maybe I can do some of it.
Right, and thinking about that in terms of a business model, right?
Absolutely.
Who can I attract to be a tenant in my space?
Right, and it's a good investment because it's expensive to have turnover in your tenants. And like I said at the beginning, everybody will age into disability. So if you want to have a long-term tenant, make your place accessible so that they can stay there for a long time. Mm-hmm.
So Dessa, I've heard you speak about viewing things through a disability justice lens. Can you talk about what that means?
Absolutely. People with disabilities are widely misunderstood, and that leads to a lot of bias and exclusion. And it really limits our opportunity to fully participate in our society and our communities. And so housing is extra important for disabled people because it's a refuge for us. It's a place for us to feel safe and comfortable, to be ourselves, to move through our space in the way that we need to, instead of the way that we often have to in public. And so from a disability justice perspective, we believe housing is a human right. We believe that accessible housing is a right. I mean, it is actually a legal right. But we know how important it is not only for our own mental and physical well-being as disabled people, but for our ability to actually participate in community, because housing is such an important part of an ecosystem of community health, not just individual health. And so we think about it in a more holistic way, so that we can actually, get out there and do the things in this world that we want to do and help make the world a better place for everyone. We need an accessible, safe, and comfortable home as our landing pad every night, and as where we can get up in the morning and go do what we do.
Kind of to be that foundation
Yes.
for all the work that you do.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Marie, let's talk a little bit about the legal standards. So can you talk about the difference between reasonable accommodations and modifications?
Yeah, of course. So a reasonable accommodation is a change in policy or procedure that allows a person with a disability to live in their housing. And so that might be a change in when the rent is due, like we discussed before. Mm-hmm. That might mean a exception to a quiet hour policy if someone has a mental health disability that makes them a little louder than other people. A reasonable modification is a change in the structure of the building. So a reasonable modification, we're talking about adding grab bars to a shower, adding a ramp to a house with stairs. Reasonable accommodations are free to the tenant. Reasonable modifications, most of the time, the tenant is responsible for paying for those modifications.
So it's not the landlord that has to pay for that?
That's correct. So the
Okay.
landlord does have to approve the modification. They
Okay.
are under a legal obligation to ensure that the person with a disability can use that housing and they can approve that modification. But most of the time, that expense is going to fall on the tenant. The exception would be if the lease has some sort of provision that says that the apartment will be accessible.
So I know people talk a lot about, fairness, and isn't it fair that everybody gets the same access and the same resources? Can you talk a little bit about how that fits in?
Yeah, so often people will say, or landlords will say, I can't make that accommodation because that's not fair to the other tenants. Mm-hmm. Fair does not mean equal. It does not mean we treat everyone exactly the same. It means that we give everyone the opportunity to enjoy, to use their housing in the same manner, right? And so that might mean that things are different from tenant to tenant because people have different needs and different accessibility challenges. And so fair is not always equal, right? So it doesn't mean that everyone has to pay their rent at the same time or that everyone has to abide by the same policies. It means what can we do to make sure everyone is enjoying the housing.
So let's go back to the accommodations. How does, practically speaking, how does a tenant request an accommodation? What are the things they need to know about that?
Yeah, so accommodations are governed by the Fair Housing Act. To request an accommodation, you just have to ask your landlord for an accommodation that will help you live in your housing. And it can be a verbal ask. As a lawyer, I would always recommend that ask be in writing. Either a text message or an email is really great. You have to you have to tell your landlord you have a disability and then ask for the policy change that you want.
Okay, so just those two things. And there might, if it's not an obvious disability like we talked about before, there might need to be some sort of note or proof from a doctor, but not if it's an obvious disability.
Yeah, so your landlord can ask you for proof. They don't have to, right?
Okay.
They're not under any legal obligation to ask you for proof, but they can. And if they do ask you for proof, what they can ask you for is documentation from a health professional that says you have a disability and that the accommodation would help alleviate your disability. Those are the only two things they can ask for.
Got it, thanks. And then what about service animals? And I know that there's idea of service animals and then support animals, and maybe you could talk about the difference of those.
Yeah, I would love to talk about the difference, Ashley. So service animals are governed by the Americans with Disabilities Act. They have a very specific definition, which it's a dog or a mini horse that performs a task for a person with a disability to alleviate that disability. An emotional support animal is a little different. An emotional support animal is an animal who provides emotional support to someone with a mental health disability.
So they don't necessarily have special training.
That's correct. An emotional support animal does not have special training and also does not have to be a dog. It can be any animal. Both emotional support animals and service animals have housing rights. So say you live in pet-free housing. Mm-hmm. If you have a service animal or an emotional support animal, you should ask for a reasonable accommodation to allow your animal to live there. A emotional support animal does require a doctor's note or a note from another mental health professional to confirm that this animal is providing emotional support to you.
Okay, so some proof is necessary for that to meet that accommodation.
Yes.
Okay.
Some proof is necessary for an emotional support animal. For a service animal, no proof is necessary, and they can be owner trained.
Oh, I didn't know that part. That's great. And so let's talk about your work is in preventing evictions. If somebody's disability is getting in the way of their paying their rent, what kind of steps can they take?
Yeah, so it's always best to try to be proactive about these issues, right? So say you're in that situation and your landlord hasn't issued you any kind of legal notice yet. You want to be proactive and ask for that reasonable accommodation as soon as possible. You want to do that in writing. Oftentimes, landlords will then follow up with a phone call, right? Because sometimes it's not in their best interest to have things in writing. I always recommend that you then reply to the email you sent before and say, thank you for the phone call on this day at this time. These are the things that we discussed. So that if you do end up in a eviction case or any other legal type of case, you have that documentation. Then save all of that documentation so you know if you end up in that situation, you have it, but hopefully your landlord will do the right thing and work with you to ensure that you can avoid legal proceedings.
Right, which is the idea, right?
Yeah.
Is that we want to have the tenants and the landlords to be working together to solve the problems rather than having to go to court
Yes.
to do that and do more work for you, for sure.
Yes.
So Dessa talked about people with disabilities knowing their rights and understanding that, but we know that sometimes there's discrimination. And what does that discrimination look like, and what should people be looking for and think, oh, wow, maybe that is something that, maybe there's discrimination here that I didn't really hit me in the face?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ashley. I would say that one of the number one things we see is people who are calling about an apartment. Maybe the landlord does the credit check ahead of time, and then the person shows up and they have an obvious disability, and all of a sudden the apartment isn't available. You know, you really want to be asking questions about whether or not that was because you showed up and you looked a certain way or you acted a certain way. Or maybe the landlord is a little extra harsh on you and your housekeeping than they are with the people around you. You want to be asking questions about, like, is this related to my disability? Because maybe if you struggle with housekeeping or you struggle with those daily tasks and your landlord is on you about that, that really is about your disability and not about you as a person or not about the landlord's policies.
Right, that's a really good point. So kind of watching for those things that might be treating somebody with disabilities a little bit different than they're treating other people.
Yes.
Yeah, and that I know we hear it in a lot of different circumstances where people have the conversation on the phone, and then when they show up, they're treated differently, and that would be a red flag.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing that you can do in that situation, if you think that's going on, is ask the other people who live in that apartment building, like, is this unit available? You know, I applied, I got here, and often people will say, like, yes, I don't understand.
Yes, it's still available, just not to you. Right. Right. So what if that happens? What if a tenant thinks that maybe there's discrimination? What should they do?
They should absolutely call their local fair housing center and report that discrimination and ask that that landlord be investigated.
Okay. Are there other organizations that are not legal organizations that might be supportive in those circumstances?
Well, organizations like Detroit Disability Power usually do referrals on things like that because we're not lawyers, but we can help direct people to resources and advice, and we can help teach them how to advocate for themselves, which is something that a lot of times disabled people need a little reminder that, you know, we're worth fighting for. You've been disempowered in many ways in your life, perhaps as a disabled person, but you do have rights and you have the ability to fight for them. And in fact, when you do, you're helping not only yourself, but other disabled people. And so that's the kind of work that we do. And then when it gets to the legal stuff, we call people like you all Lakeshore Legal Aid.
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, it doesn't seem too surprising that somebody doesn't want to take that fight on themselves, right? Like they have a lot of other things. They're trying to get their kids on the school bus and all the other things that we as people have to do in the community, and then to take on this fight. So I'm glad to hear that there are organizations that are out there. Marie, can you talk a little bit about the holistic support that Lakeshore provides for tenants who might be facing these issues?
Yeah, so in addition to eviction defense, which is obviously representing people who are currently in eviction proceedings, we also represent tenants who are asking for a reasonable accommodation and being denied or haven't yet hit eviction proceedings, but the landlord is acting in a discriminatory fashion. Like, we try to help people before we get to that point. And then we also have a great client support advocate program that tries to help people find housing that is safe and affordable and accessible for their needs.
Is there a listing, is there a place where people can go to find out where units might be that are accessible?
So we've been working on a project with the City of Detroit. So they have a portal now where you can look for available units. And when they were building that out a few years ago, we got in touch with them and said, this portal needs to be accessible so that everyone can actually use it. And they were, very happy to help make those changes. But we also said we need to be able to find accessible units because frankly, there are not enough accessible units really in any part of the country.
Right.
And we have, a big national housing crisis happening around affordability and availability, and then you add accessibility into that, and it gets even more dire for people.
Sure.
And so a portal that can help you sort by feature type is extremely helpful. And most places, most cities, don't totally know what their accessible housing stock is. And that's kind of a problem. So we have some organizing and some work to do there so that disabled people are actually getting the accessible units and they're not just being taken up by non-disabled people who, showed up first.
Right.
And also helping get it organized so that it's easier to find it. And different cities actually have knowledge of what the stock is so they can then make decisions about how much more they need.
Got it. So that's something that your group is advocating for, to try and get a place where people with disabilities could go look online and say, okay, I need to be able to get my wheelchair in here, and these are the places that are available to me.
Yes. And then what we know is that because there's not enough housing, that we then go and say, hey, you are approving this tax abatement for this big development. Maybe one of the community benefits could be more than meeting the federal requirement for accessible units, but maybe you could double or triple or quadruple that so that this housing is actually a better investment in the future, and we're not building more, we're not doubling down another generation on inaccessible housing that disabled people can't use and people cannot age in place.
Right. And just those federal laws are so, the minimum, the requirements are so low that it's really not going to meet the need.
And especially in a place like Detroit, where the housing stock is pretty old for the most part and predates a lot of these rules, we have a lot of ground to make up for here.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you both so much for being here today. It's a lot of great information, and I appreciate you sharing this. I hope that folks will reach out when they see evidence of discrimination to the resources we've provided. So thanks for joining us on Legally Speaking today.